This afternoon, our speaker is Robert Talley. Robert spent many years in the Army Intelligence Service and then as a private consultant in the Near East and the Mid East. He's been in Lebanon, I believe, and Saudi Arabia. And so he's going to talk to us about his observations of the Arab world. And then I think he's had a very interesting life once he stopped doing that. He lived on a sailboat for a number of years, and then he came to Sarasota. So we should have a very interesting afternoon. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here and to share what is just about to become an 83-year-long life. I was born on the 2nd of July, and so I'm almost there. A couple of administrative notes. There are packets with photographs and some information that may be of value to you on the seats, and if you don't have one, there are some extras up forward. And I thought we might have a big group, and I was going to ask that questions be held till the end of the program. But with this size, I don't think that would be a problem, and we can go ahead and answer anything that you want to ask. Okay, I was born, to get started, on July 2nd, 1929, in beautiful Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. My father was an officer in the Corps of Engineers and stationed in Washington. My mother was from Atlanta, Georgia. They met, married while Dad was in Georgia Tech. Shortly after I was born, my father was transferred to Managua, Nicaragua, with the job, interestingly enough, of locating a route for an alternate canal in case the Panama Canal was ever blocked. And we spent about 2 years there. And when I came back, I spoke a good deal more Spanish than I did English. And my mother paid my little cousins 5 cents a word to teach me English. I'm not sure that I've learned it as yet, but I'm working on it. On returning to the States, as things happened, my father and mother divorced. My father later met and married a Manila Davis, who was one of the original female pilots licensed in the United States. I think one of the first 20 licensed in the United States. She was a no-nonsense lady, as you might imagine. She owned an open cockpit biplane with a monster radial engine, and she was flying air shows and barnstorming when my father and she met. During my second grade, events took place that brought a modest amount of notoriety to our family. It seems that Amelia Earhart was on the way to make her around-the-world flight and stopped by our house for a couple of days to see Manila. And all I remember of Miss Earhart was a tall, lanky, nice woman who always wore slacks. And if you've seen her pictures recently, she was still wearing them. When the 8th grade came along in 1942, my dad and mother agreed I should go to military school. And Dad picked what turned out to be the prestigious Northwestern Military and Naval Academy in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And in your brochure, you have a photo of me at age 13, very proud in my uniform to be a cadet at Northwestern. This was a Scottish school and only had 120 cadets, but it had a pipe and drum corps, Scottish pipe and drum corps, and a band all laid out in kilts. And I had fumbled my way through enough clarinet lessons by this time that I was able to get in the band and wear kilts. And I thought that was real cool. Northwestern was located right on Lake Geneva, which is a lake about 20 miles long and several miles wide. Am I seeing people nod who know Lake Geneva? Ah, okay. Lovely, isn't it? Yes. The school had a fleet of sailboats, and learning to sail was mandatory. That spring, my mother bought me a used 16-foot Comet class day sailor. And I enjoyed that all the late spring after the ice melted and all that summer. When I was approaching my first year in high school, my father decided that Northwestern might be just a tad expensive. And so he enrolled me in Castle Heights Military Academy in Lebanon, Tennessee. This was in 1943. And Castle Heights was good. There were about 400 cadets in the high school. And discipline was tight, as it had been at Northwestern, but you had more free time. Unlike Northwestern, there was no significant water around Lebanon. And there was, however, a small airport. And when I turned 16 and was legally able to solo an airplane, my folks were good enough to pay for flying lessons for me. And that started 60 years of a love affair with airplanes that I still haven't gotten over. By the time I graduated high school in 1947, I moved to Beverly Hills, where my mother was living at the time. And I had enjoyed working on the paper at Castle Heights and applied for a job in the editorial section of the local paper, the Hollywood Citizen News. To my surprise, I was hired almost immediately, not as an ace reporter, but as a lowly copy boy who was little more than a gopher for the editors and reporters. But it got me on the staff. And I started looking to see what I could do to get promoted. The Citizen News was an afternoon paper, and we worked from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. And after work and on weekends, if there was something interesting like a bad accident or a fire, I'd go get the story and run back to the paper and write it up for the next day's edition. My crowning achievement as an 18 or 19-year-old reporter, fledgling, came when Santa Anita racetrack burned. And I was able to give an eyewitness account of a fireman who got caught way up on the grandstand roof and tried to save himself by jumping into the top of a palm tree down below. And part of that story was run on page 1. Sometime later, I was promoted to reporter. And in addition to covering the news, I wrote 2 feature stories a week. I hadn't been aware of it, but the alumni chapter of the University of Southern California School of Journalism gave annual awards for the best feature and news stories. And there were 2 categories. The first was the big metropolitan newspapers like the Los Angeles Times. And then the second category was the community papers like the Citizen News. And the editors submitted our entries for us. We didn't do it. But during my first year, I'd been lucky enough to hear about a retired outlaw from Oklahoma named Al Jennings, who had moved to the Los Angeles area. And I interviewed him for a feature story. You've got a picture of that in there. It turned out he had been the model for O. Henry's Cisco Kid. And he was a character, tough, wiry, mean as a snake, and even in his 70s, somebody you wouldn't want to fool with. And talking with him brought back all my enjoyment of horses, cowboys, and the Old West, and doing the story was a joy. Happily, it won first place in the community feature story division that year. The next year for me was an emotional one. I was in a childhood marriage that was disintegrating, and I got word that a large number of naval personnel from the Korean War were going to land in a few days at Burbank. I went out on the appointed day, arriving several hours early so I could talk with the families. And when the aircraft landed, I saw the love between the I'm getting senile. And I saw the love between the service people and their families, and I almost broke down. I was able to get the story, however, although back at the office, tears streamed down my face as I wrote it. Several months later, to my surprise, the story was awarded first place in that year's Community News Division. So, 2 first places in my first year as a reporter, or my first 2 years. I had to ask, what could I do if I went to college? So I resigned from the paper and drove to Norman, Oklahoma, and enrolled in the University of Oklahoma Journalism School, majoring in magazine journalism. Having to work my way through college, I got a job as assistant editor and feature writer on the University Alumni Magazine, a job I held until graduation, and felt very lucky because it was a super environment. Meanwhile, I had to take ROTC in school, and I enjoyed it. Oklahoma's ROTC prepared graduates for duty in the field artillery, the cannons. And I was lucky enough when I graduated to get a West Point type commission rather than a reserve commission. And I decided to make the Army a career. Within a month, I reported into Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for field artillery training, and then to Fort Bliss, Texas. You've been to Sill? Ah, okay. And then I was assigned to Sill for cross-training into guided missiles, anti-aircraft guided missiles. And at the end, I was assigned to what sounds quaint now, but a Nike Ajax guided missile battery, one of 16 defending Los Angeles from attack by Soviet bombers. And again, this sounds quaint, but it was serious business at the time. And the duty was difficult. Most of the units were in isolated areas, and since you never knew when the bombers might come, a large percentage of the sites had to be ready to fire on a very short notice. And you worked typically 32 hours on, 16 hours off. One day I got a call from the battery commander, and this is neat, letting me know that the movie actor Raymond Burr wanted to pay a morale visit to the battery the next day. Of course, he was starring as Perry Mason on television in those days. I, of course, was delighted. Anything to ease the pressure of a 24-hour-a-day schedule on the men and, of course, on me. When Raymond Burr showed up the next day, I toured him around, showed him the radars, ran through a couple of simulated fire missions on some unsuspecting airliners, I should add. And he really enjoyed it. In the process, I told him about the rigors of our duty and suggested he might want to do a troop show for the 16 units around Los Angeles and those around the Bay Area, Portland, and Seattle. He jumped at it, and we agreed that I would help put it together, providing we could get clearance from the powers that be. When he left, I called my battery commander, and he agreed to pave the way, and literally by the next day, we had cleared to hold shows all up and down the West Coast. I called Raymond, and we agreed to meet at his house the following Sunday to start putting the show together. And this went on for 4 or 5 Sundays, at which time we had a series of comedy skits loosely tied to life on a guided missile site. If you can imagine this, Raymond played a goofy, sad sack soldier. I mean, this reserve Canadian, right? And he enjoyed the role tremendously, and troops from our battery filled out the rest of the cast. The show opened at our battery, and it went on to play all 40-some-odd sites on the West Coast. This was a pleasant interlude that I thought was finished, but it was far from it. The aide-de-camp, personal assistant to the commanding general at Fort MacArthur, was completing his tour, and the general was looking around for a replacement. You see where this is going, right? Somebody suggested me for the job. I was taken to Fort MacArthur and interviewed by the brigade chief of staff, a colonel, I hardly knew what a colonel was at that time. And then by the general. And in a week, my family and I were moving to Fort MacArthur, on the south side of Los Angeles and right next to LA Harbor. As fate would have it, my office window looked directly out on the fence separating Fort MacArthur from the luxurious California yacht anchorage, where Frank Sinatra, Humphrey Bogart, Ward Bond all had boats. Soon I had a tiny cruising sailboat tied up there. And when the general had no requirements for me for the weekend, my family and I would often sail the 22 miles across the sea to Catalina and tie up at Avalon for a couple of days. That was lovely. This lasted for about 2 years until 1963, when I was sent to Fort Sill for field artillery training, and then to Aschaffenburg, Germany for 3 years with an artillery battalion. Never one to sit still, my wife and I used Germany as a base of operations and traveled pretty much all over Europe, including up through Denmark, Sweden, through the Arctic Circle to, Norway, and then back down. But anyway, we went about 300 miles inside the Arctic Circle, which was neat. Along the way, I heard from a friend that there was something called a Foreign Area Specialist Training Program. And there were some 20 geographic areas that you could specialize in and work in intelligence or military assistance or whatever for the rest of your career. And I looked up the regulation and was drawn to the Arab world, because it was a turbulent region that would provide a year of language school at beautiful Monterey, California, plus 3 years in the Arab world, including travel from Morocco to, on the Atlantic, to Pakistan on the east, and from Turkey in the north to Ethiopia in the south, plus 2 years for a master's degree at American University of Beirut. I applied, and when my tour in Germany was over, we went to Monterey, south of San Francisco, to the Defense Language Institute for the year of Arabic study, and what a shock that was. I thought I knew what tension was in the Army. I don't think I've ever been in anything as high pressure as the work there. All the instructors were Arabs, native speakers, mostly Iraqis, and I won't comment on Iraqis, and gave little slack. We had 6 hours of classes a day, and if you were lucky, you got by with 3 hours of homework at night. I felt the pressure, as you can imagine, and needed some comic relief. Fortunately, there was an airport at Monterey, and I returned to flying, and my wife and I took trips around Southern California. That was tough. One of the best was with another couple to Lone Pine in the high Sierras. Anybody been there, Lone Pine? It's a drop-off point for climbing Mount Whitney at 14,505 feet, the highest peak in the continental United States. We made the climb, actually a long hike, and felt good about it. After language school in 1968, we were shipped to Beirut, Lebanon for the next 3 years, and I reported in to the military attaché in the embassy. I didn't realize at the time, but the culture shock of suddenly landing in the Arab world had been eased by my experience at the language school, dealing with Arabic instructors every day for a year, seeing orientation films on the Arab world, and simply the casual discussions with the instructors on their lives and families in the Arab world. Still, on landing, there was no question we'd entered another world, as you can imagine. Strange architecture, signs written in Arabic, and among other things, the constant noise, car horns, calls to prayer, and routine conversations held by Western standards at a full shout. Plus, many of the men wore the Arab dress, and the women the veils, and so on. Lebanon had been placed under French control after the First World War, and the influence was still strong, which contributed to Beirut having marvelous hotels and restaurants, and probably the highest level of culture in the Arab world. Beirut was also a city of apartments, and we eventually settled into a 3-bedroom on the 6th floor of a building within walking distance of both the university and the embassy. By American standards, it was crudely built, but it was spacious with huge rooms, 13-foot ceilings, would you believe? Arabs don't like to look out and feel constrained by having a roof pressing down on them. They want to see distance. Also had a 100-foot balcony on one side to the dining room and to the den to the living room, overlooking the Mediterranean and Beirut. That was tough. We foreign area students, and there were 5 of us when I got there, were assigned, as I said, to the military attaché and had an office where we could study, take private Arabic lessons, and keep track of what was taking place in the Middle East. Having said that, I should mention that we were specifically prohibited from doing anything that smacked of intelligence, because if we were caught snooping around or asking the wrong questions, we could be thrown out and all of our successors could be denied the opportunity to be there. So we were careful. I got my master's degree at the American University of Beirut in the Arab Studies program, and it was excellent. The university operated under the New York Board of Regents, and many of my instructors, the overwhelming majority of Arabs, were big guns in their fields, and thus my pro-Arab indoctrination began, and I'm guilty. When the university was not in session, I traveled. One trip involved a month flying across North Africa and working my way back with 6-day stops in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. That was a lovely, lovely trip, as you can imagine. And I would stop in the embassies and get briefings and find out what was going on. Another trip, this for 6 weeks, driving a Chevrolet carryall, 4-wheel drive, fortunately, took me from Beirut through Syria, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and back. And I'm sorry, I tried to have maps for you for this, but between the library and whatever the bookstore was that we went, nobody could come up with anything that would copy. So use your imagination if you would, please. The carryall had diplomatic plates from the embassy, so there was no problem about people wanting to inspect the vehicle. The back end was rigged for sleeping and cooking, so most nights I'd look for empty desert and made camp as far from civilization as possible. I had a shotgun for what good it might have done, but was never bothered, which to me is amazing on a 5,000 or more long trip. Another good trip was the week I spent in Israel. Since it wasn't possible to travel directly from an Arab country into Israel, I flew to Cyprus, and then caught a plane then back to Israel. I must admit that by this time I had been so brainwashed by the Arabs that I really didn't know what to expect, but I was very pleasantly surprised. I rented a car and traveled pretty much all around the country, finding the people refreshingly modern and friendly. And I learned a few things that trip. Another highlight of the tour was spending 5 months with units of the Jordan Arab Army. I went around and spent maybe 3 weeks with each of the units that I visited. The stated purpose was to improve my Arabic by having me speak only Arabic, but it also provided a broad perspective on life in an Arab army and why they're not more effective than they could be. Some of the reasons for this: The Arab as an individual is not as motivated or consistently organized as Westerners or Israelis. His highest ideal is leisure. And if he can have leisure, he has his little world under control. His mode of operation usually involves long periods of lethargy, punctuated by moments of intense activity. He has many conflicting loyalties and values. He owes allegiance primarily to his immediate family and to his clan, and typically resents authority from anyone outside the clan. He can be brutal and callous by our standards, showing no mercy to anyone who he feels doesn't deserve it. If you'd like to get further insight into the Arab mentality, you can check out a book called The Arab Mind by Raphael Patai. He's written 37 books in Hebrew and English, and the Arab Mind is about that thick, and it's a definitive work. I will mention that the foreword happens to have been written by a former foreign area student with me in Beirut named Tex Atkin, and Tex has done some good work. Now, to the fun part. I should say that anyone who lives in the Arab world has stories to tell about things that happened to him. And I'd like to tell you a few of mine. 3 Lebanese men that I knew, nice guys, caught a shoplifter taking things from a shop in Beirut that belonged to a friend of theirs. They could have notified the police, but instead they loaded him into a car, drove just outside of the main business area to a place on the coast called Pigeon Rocks, which 2 people a year visit. And they told me that they said to him, "You will never shoplift in our area again." And they placed his hands on 2 boulders and took heavy stones and beat them until the hands were about 3 times their normal thickness, and most, if not all, the bones were broken. And some things you might run into are right out of Alice in Wonderland. Later on in Saudi Arabia, one of my men got picked up for a traffic ticket and was taken to the local police station in the capital, Riyadh. I was called to the station to try to bail him out. By the time I got there, the police had discovered an open bottle of hair tonic in the car, and this hair tonic contained alcohol. The ranking police captain confronted my man with it and charged him with drinking, which the man totally denied, and they couldn't do anything about it. The captain then gave the bottle to a private with instructions to take it to a bathroom and pour it out. The private agreed. The captain turned back to my man, and over his shoulder I saw walking down the hall this private with that bottle up, emptying it. Huh?
Did he grow hair?
I don't know, but I'm sure he got a glow out of it. Okay, many Muslim men are conflicted about their romantic relationships. One night I happened to see a Lebanese man I knew in a bar in Beirut. He was about 3 sheets to the wind, and when I sat down beside him, he put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Mr. Robert, I love you." And I removed his arm and said, "Ahmed, you need a wife." He said, "Will you bring me one?" I saw that conversation wasn't going anywhere, so I excused myself and left. When I was at Readiness Command in Tampa, I was assigned to escort an 8-man Arab military delegation around the country for a month, and I won't tell you what nationality. At meals, I normally took their orders in Arabic and translated for the waiters. These were devout Muslims who, of course, did not drink. But along the way, I found that when I was away from the table at breakfast, the two senior people who spoke some English would occasionally order drinks for themselves, one a Bloody Mary with tomato juice and the other a screwdriver with orange juice. After that, so the rest of the officers on the trip didn't know what was going on, I would ask one if he wanted tomato juice and the other if he wanted orange juice. And of course they said yes, they caught on immediately, and from then on they had their drinks at breakfast. The officers knew that pork, bacon, and ham were khanzir, which is simply pig meat. And it's proscribed under Islamic law and hard to get, if not out of the question, in the Arab world. But some of this group that I was taking around the country at breakfast would still order ham and eggs with a side of bacon, bacon and eggs with a side of sausage, sausage with a side of ham. And this, it turned out, was not terribly unusual. Then I got to tell you a story about one of my favorite people in this world, Joe the Turk. It's not his real name, but what he was called by Westerners, he cultivated as friends. Joe was in his 40s, the offspring of a family that came to Lebanon from Turkey. He identified himself emotionally, not as Lebanese, but as Turkish, and took pride in his toughness. And he was a formidable individual. He was stocky, but not fat, bull neck, massive shoulders, wide handlebar mustache, and a gray crew cut, if you can imagine. In addition to running his family's small grocery store, we understood he was paid by embassies for gathering intelligence for them on issues in Lebanon. I got to know Joe because when we arrived in Beirut, the embassy set us up in a temporary apartment right near his grocery store. Shortly after we arrived, our kids were walking to school, and some older Arab kids came out and started throwing rocks at them. My kids went screaming back to Joe's store, and he said, "You come here tomorrow, and I will take care of it." So, and the next day, when the kids got to the store, there were two men with Joe, all wearing long overcoats. And it wasn't cold. One of my kids asked what was Joe going to do, and he opened his overcoat, had the two men open theirs, and they had pistols and long guns under the coats. When my kids set out with Joe and his men, maybe half a block, these older Arab kids came running out, going to do them in, and they saw Joe and his men, turned around, and we never saw those kids again. Joe was tough and potentially violent, but he had a big heart. One of his Western girlfriends gave him a miniature poodle, a white poodle that they named Fifi. And Joe was immediately in love. He doted over Fifi, carried her around, and took her for walks at least several times a day. One evening, the doorbell at our apartment rang, and I opened the door. It was Joe. Tears streamed down his face, and I immediately thought something had happened to his elderly mother. And I said, "Joe, what is it? Is it your mother?" And I'll try to reply like he did. "No, it was Fifi!" And so I told him to come in, and we sat down, and he said he had taken Fifi out for a walk, and she had somehow gotten out of her collar and gotten loose and run into the street. And Joe said, "And I called her, and she would not come, and a car hit her. I yelled for the man in the car to stop, and he didn't, so I put 3 bullets in the back of his car, and he still wouldn't stop." I don't think I would either, but that was Joe. He was a good friend for the 3 years we were in Beirut, looked out for my family. And I heard a couple of years after I left Beirut that he had been murdered by someone from an opposing political faction. After we returned to the States for a short time, and then I was off for 4 weeks of airborne training, parachute training, at Fort Benning, a year in beautiful Vietnam, and then to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 9 months of Command and General Staff College. Following that, I was assigned to the U.S. Readiness Command in Tampa. And REDCOM, as it was known at the time, had responsibility for U.S. military interests in the Middle East. And I was put in charge of briefing the commander-in-chief and his staff on intelligence dealing with the Arab world. But there also, and this was neat, I was able to go on active airborne status and accumulated a total of a little over 40 jumps. And I appreciated that. In 1974, I was notified I was being posted to serve for 2 years in a diplomatic assignment as military attaché in Saudi Arabia. Shortly thereafter, we moved to Jeddah on the Red Sea, where the embassy was located. Now, the capital was, of course, Riyadh, which is in the interior of the country. But the ever-suspicious Saudis wanted to keep the foreigners out at a distance. So Jeddah became the diplomatic capital. Americans were, and I still believe, are held in high regard by the Saudis. We've had a large military training mission there for many years. I think shortly after World War II it was set up. And the U.S. has supported the Saudi government as a conservative ally. When my family and I arrived, I took over the military attaché villa that was the traditional home of the military attaché when he was in Jeddah. And many of the Americans that we knew considered it more like a post office than a residence. It was a big, monstrous, 2-story building. And we inherited 3 servants, a Yemeni cook, a Sudanese houseboy, and a Lebanese driver. The work was interesting. There were enough matters for me to deal with that I had fairly regular meetings with King Faisal, and when he was assassinated, King Khalid, and with then Prince, now King Abdullah, who was then commander of the National Guard, and of course the defense minister, Prince Sultan. As you can imagine, meetings with high-level Saudi royalty were formal. Appointments were made through the protocol office, and you're expected to give such details as who was planning to attend, subjects to be discussed, what was expected to result, and the length of time required. On being ushered into the Saudi's office at the time of the meeting, you would approach the senior person, remain at a distance, salute, and receive perhaps a guarded smile and nod, and then seats would be indicated for you and whoever was with you. At that point, you would normally wait until you received a signal from the senior Saudi to proceed. Then you would present your business in English and wait while an interpreter translated. Everything from the American's position would be couched in the most respectful, polite terms possible. And when the meeting was ending, it was appropriate for the senior American to stand and formally thank the royal for the meeting and to express appreciation for the Saudis' wise counsel. There were many subjects that, bless their hearts, I'm not sure the Saudis had a clue about what we were talking about, but we always thank them for their wise counsel. Of course, we're not perfect either, at least I'm not. On the personal side, official entertaining was absolutely constant. A good 3 nights a week, either in or out. We would go for days almost without seeing the kids. As my tour was coming to an end in 1976, I received word I was being posted to the Pentagon. And I will have to admit that as a middling lieutenant colonel, dealing regularly with the king and other senior officials, I was spoiled. As well, my marriages in our family do this, as well my marriage of 27 years was falling apart. And since I had now reached 20 years of service, I decided it would be a good time to retire. By the way, Holly Ann and I have been together 30 years, and we don't have any interest in anything happening. I settled in Tampa with my sons, began buying, renovating, renting, and selling houses to augment my Army retirement. And about a year later, a Swedish friend I'd known in Saudi came by, saw what I was doing, and said, "Hey, I've got a contractor friend in Saudi who needs somebody who's doing what you're doing." And so I called him up. It turned out he was a graduate of American University of Beirut, and his father was a former military attaché in Washington. So it was kind of a natural. A few weeks later, after completing the jobs there, I flew over to Saudi with 4 of my sons and a list of, I flew to Saudi with 4 of my sons and a list of tradesmen who wanted to work there. We landed and shortly were hard at work. Within a month, I had to send for additional workmen. And for the next 2.5 years, it never slowed down. A word on American and European workers, particularly in the trades. You know, they like to have that beer after work, and on weekends, they want to kick up their heels, neither of which are really possible in Saudi Arabia. It was not uncommon for foreign hires to show up in Saudi, take one look at the lifestyle, and 2 days later get on an airplane and pay their way back. After another 2.5 years, I decided it was time to go back to the States, and I fell in love with a 32-foot motor sailor. I moved aboard, and by this time I'd met my lovely wife, Holly Ann, the first Jew I'd really spent time with. She turned out to be a solid sailor and game for the open ocean. We cruised the Keys down to the dry Tortugas and then cast off for the 400 to 500 mile crossing to Isla Mujeres on the Mexican coast. About 10 months later, we sailed around the Mexican coast, followed the coastline up to Brownsville, which was a nice trip. And there I became aware of a Gulf Star 43. And if you can hear my heart go pity-pat, it is. This boat is one I had admired for a long time. It had a 14-foot beam, width 14 feet, 3 cabins, 2 central air conditioning systems, 2 full baths, a diesel generator, radar, a wind generator, an automatic pilot, and an enclosed pilot house. You've got a picture of it at the next to the last page there. Yeah. When it was ours, we moved aboard and lived on it for over 10 years. Cutting this last part short, we settled back in Tampa, and I saw an ad for a computer science instructor at Southwest Florida College. Does anybody know that school? Okay, private junior college. And I had worked along the way as part of my misspent youth with Radio Shack teaching their computers, and so I walked into this one well armed. Then I got tired of that, and I began working as a professional guardian. Does anybody know anybody who's a professional guardian? Huh? No, this is a professional guardian. But anyway, it sounded like a marvelous retirement activity, and it turned out to be. It's also quite productive because you make $80 or $85 an hour if your client has money. If not, then you do it as a freebie. But after a year and a half, I had some 35 cases and was working 10 to 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. Not all of it got paid, of course. But if you're looking for something to do as a retirement activity, I couldn't recommend anything higher than guardianship. You work with marvelous attorneys, the court's on your side, life is good. Now, while working as a guardian, I continued flying, and 12 years ago bought the airplane that's on the last page of your packet. 4-place fabric-covered airplane with 150 horsepower and a tricycle landing gear. For you pilots, you know that the tricycle landing gear is meaningful. It's much easier to deal with than the conventional. On a good day, this airplane would do 115 miles an hour. But that was fast enough that I took several trips to California to see my family and one trip to Anchorage, Alaska for a Piper Aircraft convention. Another good trip, and I like this one, was to Dyersville, Iowa, where the location of the motion picture set for the movie Field of Dreams is located. And I made that trip, picked up one of my sons in Chicago, went over to Dyersville, spent a day and a half touring the site, and then headed back. But that was lovely. That's quite a movie. The good life, as I've been talking about it, lasted until about 2005 when I started having strange physical symptoms. Shortly afterwards, I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And not long after that, Holly Ann, too, was diagnosed with lymphoma. And neither one of us was comfortable with our oncologists in Fort Myers, but we heard of a Dr. Richard H. Brown in Sarasota. And his reputation was such that we asked for an appointment. He said, "I'll be glad to treat you, but not 90 miles away." Based on that, we decided to move to Sarasota and did so 4 years ago. And we bought 3 blocks east of the temple and have been glad ever since. And I think you all know that Dr. Brown is a member of the temple. Yeah, neat guy. Okay, in closing, I'd like to mention something about my joining the temple. When Holly Ann, who was born Jewish, and I met, I went with her to occasional services at the synagogue she was attending. And I appreciated the worship, but nothing really clicked. That is until we began coming to Temple Beth Shalom. And I realized I had found the religious home that I'd been seeking. Shortly thereafter, I proposed to Holly Ann at an oneg, got down on my knees at the oneg, asking her to marry me in the Jewish faith, and converted, would you believe, 3 years ago tomorrow, and became a Jew by choice. And I've been delighted ever since. And that, in 2 nutshells, is my little life. Yes. Did you have a question?
No, I was just going to make a statement.
Yes, please do.
I've come to almost all of these interesting lives since I've not been working. And I have to tell you, Bob, this happens to be at the very top.
Well, thank you.
Everything you said was just so interesting and so different than the other people and beautifully spoken. I just hung on to every one of your words. Thanks. I wish you could give this again to some other people here, because it's phenomenal. It's so interesting. And
well, you're very tolerant.
yeah, and I wanted to ask a question.
Yes.
I was a little kid during the World War II, but all my cousins on both sides of our family, there were 8 children on both sides of the 2 families, the Gelman family and the Bank family. And they had a lot of children, a lot of boys, and the boys were all asked to go, not asked, demanded to go into World War II. And thank God they all came back. We were very lucky families, both of us, both sides of our family, the Bank and the Gelmans. And we had a big party afterward. And one of the things that upset me, and since you weren't Jewish, you probably didn't pay any attention to it. The boys all went overseas. My brother was scheduled to do so, but was injured in a terrible accident in up near Alaska when he was driving in a truck and the truck turned over and 3 or 4 people were hurt badly. He was one of them. So he didn't go overseas, but the other boys in the family, and there was about 15 of them, 7 or 8 on each side. And when they came back, and after they sort of came back into the swing of things in St. Louis, Missouri, a couple people asked them, did they have any problems? And 2 or 3 of them said, I don't know if any of your people heard this kind of thing, that they were criticized because the Jews weren't in the army. And I wondered if you'd ever heard, quote unquote, anything about that the Jewish people never put their children in the army. So it bothered all of our family because we had, as I said, 15.
In the deep, dark, distant past, I may have heard comments along those general lines. I went to these 2 military schools that I went to, had a lot of Jewish cadets.
I had an uncle who was a full colonel in the United States Army, but of course he wasn't originally Jewish, Colonel Henry Nicholas. But he married my aunt, and they practiced Judaism. I'm sorry.
That's one of the sad chapters in our American life. Anything else?
What did you think about finding Amelia Earhart's little jar? Did you hear about that on an island? Did you hear that story?
I'm going to turn up my hearing aids.
Oh.
What?
They said that they found a jar that was Amelia Earhart's on an island just recently. And
it was in the water
somehow, and they dug it up, and because it was her kind of cream that was in it, or her type of jar, they said that it belonged to her, and that maybe after she crashed, she was on this island. Have you heard that? It was on the news the other night.
I saw the first hint of that news story, and I wanted to watch it, but something happened and I missed it.
Well, and then they showed a jar, and one similar, one that she used, and it was on a little island somewhere where her plane could have landed. So they're searching to see if there's anything else.
Terrific, yes.
Yeah, so that was just on the news the other day, I think.
Yeah.
So they're still looking.
My stepmother thought the world of her, Amelia Earhart. Yeah. Yes?
When you went to Israel, was Israel a nation at that time?
I didn't work in Israel beyond my active duty service in the Army. And Israel was very much a state by that time, yes. This would have been in 60s, 70s. I would have to go back. Yeah.
You ought to put this, you ought to write a book.
I beg your pardon?
Did you write a book about this? You should.
Oh, bless your heart, I have bound copies of my master's thesis, which was on the state of Dubai. And Dubai was just emerging as an economic power in the Middle East at that time.
Where was Dubai? Was it here? Istanbul? No.
Dubai is a sheikhdom on the Indian Ocean. Yeah.
Oh, I know why I said Dubai. We had a little girl that lived with us for 1 year while we were in Boca Raton, and I can't remember the year, 1970 to 80. And Nuran Akar was from Istanbul, Turkey. And she was asked, she got an admission to high school here to spend 1 year to learn about the Americans. And when the year was over, she went back to Istanbul and then went to college. And we just loved her, and we still correspond with each other. And I can't tell you, it's probably 25 years later, 30 years later. And after she graduated college, the Hilton hotel chain grabbed her. They just grabbed her off this school because she could speak 6 languages. She'd lived in America a year. She was a native Istanbul girl. And she went to Dubai. That's why I had it in my head.
Okay.
And she went to work at the Hilton Hotel there in Dubai to put all the furniture in proper place. And she's still with them after all these years and one of their top people.
This is far away from our subject, but you could fall in love with Turkey.
Oh, phenomenal.
Yes.
Beautiful place. And they were very nice. She was not a religious Islamist Her family wasn't, but she took us in and out of all the mosques in Istanbul. Well, there weren't that many, a couple of them, great big ones, huge.
Sure.
And when we were we went all around Turkey, made a big circle. And in one of the other places afterward, when we were, I forget where we were, could have been in Italy, we went into a mosque. You said 13 feet. This one had to be 23 feet high. You couldn't even see the top. It was gigundous. 2,000-3,000 people could be in this place at one time. And
You went to the Hagia Sophia in Turkey.
Yeah,
in
maybe.
Istanbul.
Maybe
Yeah.
that's.
Okay. Anything else? Are we all talked out? Okay. Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed it.